In 1933, Germany produced fewer cars than Czechoslovakia. By 1944, those same factories were churning out thousands of tanks, fighter planes, and rockets. What happened in between wasn't just industrial growth, it was systematic transformation, and it started with one man's obsession. Adolf Hitler hated cars, not the idea of them, but the reality of who could afford them. When he took power in January 1933, only 1 in 50 Germans owned an automobile. In America, it was 1 in 5. For Hitler, this wasn't just an economic gap, it was a symbol of Germany's weakness, a reminder of defeat in the First World War and the humiliation that followed. But here's what made Hitler different from other dictators fixating on national pride. He understood that industrial capacity wasn't just about production numbers, it was about infrastructure. But skilled labor, supply chains, and the ability to pivot that entire system toward a single purpose. The automotive industry was perfect. It required precision engineering, mass production techniques, and a workforce trained in metalworking and assembly, skills that translated directly to weapons manufacturing. Hitler didn't just want more cars on German roads. He wanted an industry he could weaponize the moment he decided war was inevitable. And by 1933, he'd already decided. His first move was surprisingly conventional. He slashed taxes on new vehicle purchases and poured money into Autobahn construction. Between 1933 and 1938, Germany built over 3,000 kilometers of highway. American newspapers celebrated it as progressive infrastructure policy. They missed the point entirely. Those autobahns weren't designed for family road trips, as they were military transport corridors, built wide enough for tanks and troop carriers, strategically routed to connect industrial centers with future front lines. The car companies didn't resist. Why would they? Daimler-Benz, Opel, BMW, they were struggling survivors of the Great Depression. Hitler offered them government contracts, subsidies, and protection from foreign competition. He promised a boom and he delivered, sort of. Car production did increase. From 1933 to 1938, output quadrupled, but look closer at what they were actually building. By 1936, nearly 30% of vehicles rolling off German assembly lines were trucks and military transports. Passenger cars were becoming the side business. The factories were already shifting, and most Germans celebrating their new prosperity had no idea what was coming. Oh, then came the Volkswagen, Hitler's pet project, the people's car that would supposedly put every German family on 4 wheels. Massive factory constructed, thousands of workers recruited, tens of thousands of Germans paying into a savings program to reserve their vehicle. Production was set to begin in 1940. It never happened. Not a single Volkswagen was delivered to a civilian customer during the Nazi era, because by 1939, that state-of-the-art factory with its cutting-edge assembly lines wasn't making cars anymore. It was making military vehicles. Kubelwagens for the Wehrmacht, Schwimmwagens, amphibious troop carriers. The factory, designed to democratize automobile ownership, became another cog in Germany's war machine. This wasn't a sudden pivot forced by the outbreak of war. Once, documents show planning for military conversion began in 1937, 2 years before Germany invaded Poland. The passenger car boom, the Autobahn construction, the Volkswagen promise, all of it was a facade. Hitler was building a war industry from day one, just packaging it as economic revival. By 1941, nearly every automotive factory in Germany had ceased civilian production entirely. Daimler-Benz was building aircraft engines. BMW switched to motorcycle production for military dispatch riders and components for the Luftwaffe. Opel, ironically owned by American company General Motors until 1942, manufactured trucks that would carry German troops across Europe. The transformation was staggering in its speed and totality. An industry that barely existed a decade earlier was now producing tens of thousands of military vehicles annually, all employing hundreds of thousands of workers, many of them forced laborers from occupied territories. The factories ran around the clock. Efficiency became obsession. Any bottleneck, any production delay could mean the difference between victory and defeat on the Eastern Front. But there was a problem Hitler hadn't fully accounted for: the same centralization and industrial concentration that made the transformation so effective also created a massive vulnerability. These weren't small workshops scattered across the countryside. They were enormous factory complexes, easily identifiable from the air, packed with machinery and workers. And by 1943, the Allies had figured out exactly where they were. The bombing campaigns that followed didn't just damage Germany's war production. They systematically dismantled the industrial base Hitler had spent a decade building, factory by factory, city by city. What came next would determine not just who won the war, but whether Germany's automotive industry would survive at all. The first major raid hit Stuttgart in September 1944. American B-17S targeted the Daimler-Benz plants, dropping over 1,800 tons of explosives. Production dropped 40% overnight. 2 weeks later, they came back. Then again, the British joined in, favoring night raids with incendiary bombs that turned factory districts into infernos. BMW's Munich facilities were struck repeatedly throughout 1944 and early 1945. By war's end, nearly 80% of the plant was destroyed. Opel's Rüsselsheim factory, once the most productive in Germany, Audi was hit so hard that witnesses described the ruins as unrecognizable. The Volkswagen plant in Wolfsburg, that symbol of Nazi industrial ambition, was bombed multiple times. By May 1945, 2/3 of it lay in rubble. Here's the staggering part. By the time Germany surrendered, automobile production had essentially ceased to exist. The factories that remained standing were shells. Machinery lay twisted and buried under debris. Supply chains had completely collapsed. Workers were dead, displaced, or fleeing the advancing Allied armies. The industry Hitler had built into a war machine had been systematically destroyed by the very war it was designed to support. But the destruction didn't end with the bombing. After Germany's surrender, the Allies implemented a deliberate policy of industrial dismantling. Factories weren't just damaged, they were intentionally taken apart. The Potsdam Agreement authorized the victorious powers to seize German industrial equipment as reparations. Entire assembly lines were disassembled, crated up, and shipped to the Soviet Union, France, Britain, and other Allied nations. The Soviets were particularly aggressive. They stripped factories bare, taking everything from machine tools to office furniture. What couldn't be moved was often demolished to prevent any future military use. The goal wasn't subtle. Germany's industrial capacity, especially its ability to produce vehicles and machinery, was to be permanently crippled. By 1946, German automobile production had dropped to approximately 10,000 vehicles annually. To put that in perspective, that's less than what a single factory produced in a busy month before the war. The survivors, both companies and workers, faced an impossible situation. No raw materials, no functioning supply chains, no capital for rebuilding. The occupation authorities initially prohibited production beyond basic repairs and essential civilian vehicles. Then something unexpected happened. The Cold War changed everything. As tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union escalated, the strategic calculation shifted. A completely destroyed Germany wasn't useful to anyone. The Americans and British realized they needed a functioning German economy, partly to reduce the burden of occupation costs, partly to create a buffer against Soviet expansion. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, funneled billions of dollars into European reconstruction. Germany received a substantial share. Restrictions on industrial production began to ease. Volkswagen became an unlikely survivor story. The British occupation forces, needing vehicles desperately, ordered the battered Wolfsburg plant to resume production. That people's car Hitler promised finally started rolling off the line, but now under Allied supervision. By 1948, Volkswagen was producing 20,000 Beetles annually. Daimler-Benz and BMW slowly rebuilt from the ruins, focusing initially on trucks and motorcycles before returning to passenger cars. The Korean War in 1950 created new demand for vehicles and machinery, accelerating the recovery. By the mid-1950s, something remarkable had occurred. The German automotive industry wasn't just surviving, it was thriving again. The same engineering expertise, the same organizational efficiency that had made the wartime conversion so effective now drove a peacetime resurgence. Exports grew rapidly. The Volkswagen Beetle became a global phenomenon. Mercedes-Benz re-established itself as a luxury brand. BMW returned to producing the performance vehicles it was known for. By 1960, West Germany was producing over 2 million vehicles annually, making it the second largest automobile manufacturer in the world after the United States. The industry that had been obliterated just 15 years earlier was now an economic powerhouse again. Today, Germany remains one of the top automobile producers globally, a testament to both the resilience of its industrial base and the consequences of the choices made decades earlier. Hitler's vision of automotive dominance came true, just not in the way he imagined. The factories built for conquest became engines of economic recovery. The workers trained for war production became the foundation of peacetime prosperity. The infrastructure designed for military logistics now supports one of the world's most successful export industries. History doesn't repeat, but the machinery keeps running.